It's a pleasure to be with all of you this evening, wherever you are from. I'm in the Northeast, so the weather here today has been good also. We're going to do a little flashback to the past this evening as we also look to the future. So some of this may be old news, and to some of you, this may be new news. But sometimes what is old is now new, and what's new is now old. I'm going to share my screen, and then we can get started. So our topic for this evening is faith formation in a changing church. And all of you who are ministering in the church know that it's changing, whether we like it or not. And a lot of the change is not, we don't know, especially with the pandemic. Things have changed a whole lot as we have gone digitally into worship in many ways. And formation has either gone online also, or it's just been different in how it's been offered. And maybe in some places it has sort of stopped in a lot of ways as worship has been focused upon. So tonight I'm going to share a little bit about my history, my family's history, and what I have seen over the many years involved in Christian formation in the Episcopal Church. I am sort of an anomaly today. I've always known that the Episcopal Church welcomes me. And that also was the case with my parents and both sets of my grandparents. I was one of those folks that I still live in the same town I was born in, which is rare. And most of my cousins, my aunts and uncles, all of us, we went to the same Episcopal church in our town. So I was baptized, confirmed, and married at this specific church. And that was the same church my parents were married at, and my children were baptized at. One of them was confirmed at that same church. However, 60 years later, if we were to look at that church now, it is not the same. That church building is now an Islamic center. As the community around the church changed and the church didn't change as much, and having 4 Episcopal churches in a city that didn't really need 4 Episcopal churches, that church ended up closing and the property was sold and is now an Islamic center. But the church that raised me and my children, who were also raised in the church, for my children, really what formed them the most was not the church, but an Episcopal summer camp. That's where I think they really came to know what it means to be in Christian community. But neither of my children or my grandchild go to church now, except when they visit my husband and I. And so I would consider them Christmas and Easter Episcopalians, although they are still very much involved in diocesan activities associated with that same camp. So we know that 2021's a lot different than it was 100 years ago for my grandmother, not to mention 60 years ago for me as a child. And so I'm also going to tap into a little genealogy of my family here to share that, because I think we have a lot to learn from the past few generations, since the 19th century, when really Sunday school started. Sunday school is a fairly new phenomena in the whole scope of Christian history and Christian education. And the 20th century was really when there was a groundswell of interest in Christian education growing out of what was called the Sunday School Union movement. And we're going to talk about that a little bit. So lots of those of you who are educators in the public or private education field kind of know about some of that history and pedagogy of education in the past. And so much of that informed how the church then educated their children. So what we're going to do is we're going to start at the very beginning of all of this. So if we were to do that, we need to start out with our relationship with God. and where we actually get that understanding of Christian education. And that might come for its origins for us, was really looking at and examining Jewish education, because Christian education is many ways just an extension of Jewish education. The history of the Jews is really a record of their relationship with God as expressed in covenant. And we certainly have that also. We have the new covenant, but we also have the old covenant. So all of our scriptures include the Hebrew scriptures as part of our teaching and part of our learning. But for Jewish people, their educational system arose as a way to pass on faith from one generation to another. Education was natural. It was the responsibility of parents. It was formal and it was informal. And it took place on all parts, all aspects of one life. And we certainly see that in the Shema, which is from Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4-9. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord alone. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. Keep these words as I am commanding you on your heart. Recite them to your children, and on and on. We know that is a core piece of that. Children and parents and families were meant to share and learn faith since the beginning. That was how faith was passed along from generation to generation. And we know that Jesus lived following that same practice. We know he went to temple. And he taught in parables, and his followers saw him and the stories he told as their primary source, which was a lot of that was rabbinic teaching. His teaching was unstructured, but he used stories to illustrate central truths about God and the kingdom. He used dialogue, comparisons, poetry, hyperbole, and even puns for that. So Jesus comes. Jesus is crucified, died, and then resurrects. And a new church is formed out of that. But it was a Jewish church that became, a sect of it became the Christian church. And we know that the Christians lived in an environment when the rest of the culture around them were not Christians. Another real connection to our world today, at least here in the United States, certainly for much of Europe, that there were lots of other influences on people for that. But the most important duty of teachers at this time of the early church may have been to educate the new converts. So everyone was a teacher. Everyone helped shape and talk about Jesus is Lord, which is probably the first creed of the church found in 1 Corinthians. It was simply Jesus is Lord. So new converts that wanted to become Christians, the whole education, or I want to say the catechesis process of that, was to anticipate their baptism. Education was done to prepare them for their baptism. And all about preparing for that was to transmit truths about Jesus Christ. It was done primarily during the season of Lent, or even 2 or 3 years before that. But oftentimes baptisms occurred at the Easter Vigil as they confessed what their beliefs were in the creeds of that time, and Jesus is Lord was one of them. In Acts chapter 2, 37-47, we hear about how the Christian community spread and how they did teach and did form disciples through the breaking of bread, through the prayers of the people. And there is a book that I highly recommend all educators have, and that's Maria Harris's Fashion Me a People. It was written in 1989, but I think it really still holds true today, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. But she goes over 5 areas, and in Greek, they are what the early church did, how they passed on faith to one another. And first and foremost was the koinonia, the curriculum of community. you need to have a community in order to have a church or to have a Christian body together. That's all. It's all about community. And that's how the early church formed at first. And that's how our churches are formed, by communities first and foremost. Then once that community forms together, they have a curriculum, or they have a practice of prayer, the liturgia, which is where we get the word liturgy from. Following that, building upon that, there is the teaching, the didache, which are the stories of Jesus and what has been passed on from the apostles and others. So we continue what, if we want to say the curriculum we might use, the information that we're teaching children, youth, and adults, we might call that our current didache, but it really stems back to what the original curriculum of the church was. Knowing that curriculum really is a course to be run. That whole word is that it's not have all the answers, but it's a pathway that we can take to get to where we want to go, which in our case is forming Christians, forming disciples of Jesus. And then there was the kerygma, which is, how do we proclaim this good news? How do we proclaim that Jesus is Lord? If this is what we're confessing and proclaiming, how do we do that? Well, we do it through service. We do it through helping those who are in need of help, through the diaconia, or where we get the word deacon or the diaconate from that. It's a curriculum of service. So from the early church, and we're going to jump a couple thousand years here, modern Christian education then really originates in the Renaissance and the Reformation, as people became more knowledgeable about the rational self, and there was more of a hunger for knowledge, as people had a little bit more time on their hands to study, to read, even though not the whole population was reading at that time. But the church was able to really provide a lot of that. People would come to churches for rites and pastoral rites during the Renaissance and Reformation. We know it was a time of history that there was a lot of war, a lot of pestilence and revolutions and plagues, and the church was a center for people to go to. Pastoral rites, the prayers, the stained glass in churches was served as teaching tools, but people were looking to God in these times of trouble and despair, very much like they do today. So where is the church in helping pass along that faith during that time when people were looking for answers to things, when people were starting to question, not so much, but they were very, very much more rational and seeking of knowledge. And so that leads us into the more we're getting into the common area, the Sunday school movement. And it was out of the optimism of the Reformation that a lot of this took place. The Sunday school itself, when I was a child, it was called Sunday school. It wasn't called church school or Christian education. It was Sunday school. And that traces its roots back to the late 18th century. And it had nothing to do with being educated about Jesus explicitly. Perhaps implicitly it was, because the Bible was certainly used as a teaching tool for that. But how this happened is society in Europe, in England especially, society was changing from an agrarian to an industrial society. So capitalism became a thing, and it was surging along with people moving into the cities. And that included families with lots of children that tended to be of the lower class. So these folks lived in poverty. Their lives we could consider have been miserable. Poor housing, poor clothing, poor nutrition, sanitation, and education, if there even was any. Children worked in factories. They did not really complete an education at all. So along came this guy named Robert Raikes, who was part of an editing family. His father owned a newspaper, and Robert himself was an editor, and he saw himself as a champion for the poor. So he saw, and part of it was, I guess, for the upper class, saw all these children running in the street, dirty, uneducated, and on Sundays, because factories were closed on Sundays. So he felt, how can I help these poor children develop better personal hygiene habits, get some discipline, because it was felt they weren't getting any discipline at home, and how can we teach them some literacy? They don't know how to read. They can't do mathematics very well, very fundamental. So we as Christians, we need to help these poor children doing that. So a little colonialism in this, even within the own society. So he felt that education was going to be an effective tool to battle all of this. And in this area where he focused on was called Sooty Alley. So a lot of chimney sweeps were in the area, and he opened a school nearby in a home of a woman who lived there, whose name was Mrs. Meredith. And so boys and girls from age 6 to about 14 were invited to come to the school for the main purpose of learning personal hygiene. That was the main focus at the beginning, and then it moved on to discipline and literacy. So they were taught to read from the Bible. They memorized the catechisms, and at the time, they probably had little books of common prayer. So they had catechisms and all of that in them. And that's how they memorized things. And then they were taken to church services on Sundays also as part of that. So what did the government have to say about this? They weren't too keen on it. Sometimes maybe that's the best way to hold down or oppress those others. But anyways, John Wesley was another one who sort of latched onto this idea. And he was one of the few clergymen who favored this Sunday school movement. And he made it an important element in what became known as the Methodist movement, which ended up coming when Wesleyanism and the Wesleys came to the United States and to the Carolinas. They brought the Sunday school movement with them. So the Sunday School Union then was formed in England and began publishing books. Remember, Robert Raikes is an editor, so there's some monetary value in some of this too. And then, as I said, they came to the United States, and in Pennsylvania and Connecticut especially, they were directly, there's lots of documentation how they were directly linked to and sponsored by churches. The American Sunday School Union was formed in 1824 with the purpose of planting Sunday schools in the Western frontier. So Sunday schools went hand in hand with church planting at that period of time. It was to move westward. Most likely also we can think of that it was for the indigenous folks also. So another part of colonization in all of this that the church was part of, maybe not such a good idea at the time and how that was used. However, the Sunday school did become an important movement and a way of missionizing the West. They also influenced a lot of society during the Victorian era. And so that's where I'm going to start going into some history. So here we've got 4 photos, and I'm going to share a little bit about these. This is my family. Welcome to my family. The picture of that family unit there is my grandmother. Edna Katherine Hess is the young lady in the pigtails that is far on the left behind her mother. Edna, or as I called her, Mima, was born in 1898. She was baptized and confirmed at St. Paul's Anglican Episcopal Church in Norwalk, Connecticut. At age 7, she received, and here's show and tell time, 2 small volumes from the Sunday school. She received a Book of Common Prayer, which is this one here. And she received this, I'm turning the page here, on Christmas 1905. So she was pretty little when she got this little tiny book that I'm sure she could not read. However, it is really dog-eared when I open it to morning prayer. So my guess is, and she used this throughout her life. I ended up with it, and her hymnal also, which was dog-eared to hymn 434. Oh, it should open right to it, which was is Jesus, the very thought of thee with sweetness fills the breast, but sweeter far thy face to see, and in thy present rest. So my grandmother also loved the Psalms, King James for sure, of all of that. She also was a member of an organization that still exists today, which was the Girls Friendly Society. And this was her pin of that. And I have her first her Sunday school pin. And some of you may remember some of these. And this says St. Paul's on it. These are still around, these kind of Sunday school pins, but this one says actually St. Paul's on it. With her education, it ended publicly when she was in 6th grade. Her church activities were the center of her life, and that continued as an adult. She reared 3 children. She participated in church life. I remember her as a small child participating in a women's club, working at bake sales and the annual Christmas fair. That's where my grandmother's peer group was in the church. So she was part of what we call the lost generation. It was a generation between 2 wars, World War I and World War II, she was really her education was really part of the Sunday school movement. Now, there was another document that I found, and this is very crinkly, but this comes from the Sunday School Union. And this was published in 1925, and on the back of it says the Christian child and God's other children in the world today, and it's from the 5th Sunday in Lent. And it's all about the mission to the Chinese. So it was a missionary church, outward looking, that Christianity needed to spread in that. Educationally, for this age level, this is the time that education was still very much child-centered. It was motivated from within. It was about telling stories, and it was not about memorization. Although things were learned by rote, but that was not the purpose. The purpose was outward looking toward the world and helping spread the gospel. It was very experiential also. People were sent out as missionaries tons of times. Going to the next generation was my mom, Trinette Ely, and she was born in 1926. So she also went to Sunday school, except she went to a different Sunday school because they did not have a car. So she went to a mission of St. Paul's Episcopal Church that was located near her neighborhood, which is really only about 3 miles from the church itself. But this mission was run by the Baptist Church, and she got a Union Sunday school pin for there. However, through the Episcopal Church, she was also a member of the Girls Friendly Society. And the Girls Friendly Society was a mission-oriented society also. Always, it was focused on prayer, and it was focused on doing good deeds for others. She moved during the war to Groton as my grandfather, during World War II, as my grandfather worked for what's now the sub base. But when they moved back to Norwalk, they began to attend the same Grace Episcopal Church. And my mom taught Sunday school. She was in the women's club. She played cards with the ladies. She did all the women things. And that was sort of parallel to what was going on education-wise in the school systems at this time. So this silent generation lived among the Great Depression and had the stock market crash. Their childhoods were cut short by the outbreak of World War II. Public education and religious education focused on being a productive citizen. During wartime, you need to be productive to be able to get things out to help the troops. It was a time when Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, 4-H clubs were focused, a lot of focus on vocational education. So suddenly girls were taking home economics and boys were taking industrial arts. Even if the girls wanted to take industrial arts and the boys wanted to take cooking and sewing, they couldn't. There was definitely a delineation with that. Schooling became much more focused, and a lot of it was pushing back on, I should have mentioned that Dewey's educational system was there for the progressive movement for my grandmother, but there was a pushback on that for my parents' generation, that you had to learn stuff. You had to learn stuff because you had to be productive. The church had to grow. American society had to build. It had to build, be productive, and be in power for that. Turning now, I'm looking at what other things I can share. Oh, this was my mom's, which I think came from her mother, and it is a daily devotional. So each day there was a devotion in it. So daily devotionals were nothing new at that period of time either. So today's devotional would have been with a little clip from Matthew 26 and 63, which is, but Jesus held his peace. Sort of, why did Jesus hold his peace? I don't know. But anyways, then there was a little prayer. I know not when I should silent be, nor know I when to speak. I come, O merciful Lord, to thee, from thee instruction seek. So it's all about what are we learning? What are we doing? Things. Let's move on to me then. I'm in the next picture. I'm about 3 years old in this, and I am guessing it is an Easter picture. My mother's pregnant with my brother in this picture, and you can't tell because, of course, then people did not show their baby bump at all. But you'll notice I've got white gloves. I've got white, little socks and Mary Jane patent leather shoes and a hat on. My dad's hamming it up for the camera, but you dressed up when you went to church. There was no question about that. Family service and Sunday school was important. There was a segregation at that time. Suddenly, because of Sunday school becoming more like the public schools, and was a baby boom, lots more children. Children were not in worship with their parents. Children went to Sunday school, adults went to church, and most of the time it was morning prayer, Holy Communion. My grandmother had the Common Book of Prayer from 1883 or 1889. My parents had the 1928 Book of Common Prayer, which is what I grew up in. I was confirmed when I was 12, and that's when I could receive communion. My confirmation preparation involved learning the Apostles' Creed, the 10 Commandments, and my bounden duty. It was all about following Christ and serving God and spreading God's kingdom for that. Looking and very much like the school system, we memorized stuff. In Sunday school, we colored pictures. Someone read the Bible to us, and that's about all I remember from that. I did remember we received Sunday school pins just like this, and sadly, I put mine in a very secure place that I cannot find. But we would receive bars underneath them for each year. So it was a very oriented toward reward system. So if you showed up at church, attendance was taken. There was usually a superintendent of Sunday school. Attendance was closely taken. And if you were not there in church, just like school, you had to bring a note why you weren't there on that Sunday. And then you would get credit. So it wouldn't wreck your attendance. Very competitive, very product oriented, in having to learn things. At this time, the Episcopal Church itself definitely got into the publishing business of curriculum. The Protestant Episcopal Church, or as we know it today, we might call the Domestic and Foreign Missionary Society, published a bunch of curriculum. First and foremost was called the Seabury Series. That was a curriculum that every Episcopal church was supposed to use. And what it stressed was units on Jesus, Christmas, Easter, Bible, heroes of the church, giving money, the necessity of laws, how you behaved in church, what the hymnal was, what the prayer book was, what our talents were, a big focus which still exists today in some places of what your time, talent, and treasure is. Mite boxes were real important as a kid to save our money to send to children, poor children in other places around the world. There was a lot of, the Seabury series was used in a lot of churches, but it wasn't used in all. And it was extremely, a lot of money was put into it. And the whole purpose of it was to emphasize family worship for that. And that somehow missed the mark in evaluation of that because it was just used as another curriculum in Sunday schools. Children were not included in worship as it was intended to be. There was supposed to be a weekly class for parents and godparents in the curriculum. That was not fully used. And there was a big focus on religious and educational preparation for teachers. It was a huge amount of stuff. And a lot of that is in boxes of mine in a storage unit that will be going to the archives of the Episcopal Church for that. But family services for me were offered on Sunday mornings. Sometimes I remember singing the same songs over and over again at those family services, and they were Onward Christian Soldiers, Stand Up for Jesus, and Holy, 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 over and over again for those. But in the 1970s, we do have a shift, and that now I'm going to talk about my daughter. Rebecca Mckenzie Hayes was born in 1982. She never knew what it was like not to be included in receiving communion because she was brought up on the Common Book of Prayer from 1979. So she received communion the first time she put her hand out to receive. But she was still in a Sunday school that was pretty much segregated from the rest of the church. Although there was a time we moved when children came in at the peace. And so they were there at that time. She grew up with Living the Good News lectionary-based curriculum, the Episcopal Church's children's curriculum, both published outside of the Episcopal Church by other entities. She ended up teaching church school in high school, but after college only attended church on a regular basis. She was passionate about the environment, race, feminist, and LGBTQ issues, which she still is today. She got married in the church. Her daughter was baptized in an Episcopal church. But she's like most millennials, and my son also, and you can see Rebecca's holding a mite box there. So it's Easter Sunday in this picture. She's on the cusp of the millennials. She says she's not a millennial, but she says she's that in between that. And she's not a digital native like children are today, but she's fully connected today. So she bridges that gap of not being a native, but definitely digitally savvy. The time of my children when they were coming of age, education was important, but teachers were among those in our society that had failing salaries. So education was not as important. There was a rise in censorship. There was a lot of book banning and, conversations about school prayer. And there was a greater push for student athletes. So what ended up happening, because the blue laws that I grew up under, in which worship was not to be held, or no activities on Sunday mornings were held. Certainly Sunday morning activities were held for my children. So more and more children participated in sports, not as much as today, but there was, Sundays were open to just about anything for that. So where's the Episcopal Church in all of this? We know in 1952, so my generation, we had the Book of Common Prayer. Confirmation was often taught from the catechism that was in that, or as today we call it, the outline of the faith. Morning prayer was the main part of worship. Sunday school was segregated, and we know there was the Seabury series curriculum. However, the Seabury series was a success, but it wasn't used universally as the Episcopal Church hoped it would be. In the 1970s, the Episcopal Church, through General Convention, thought that we need to get a better grasp on this. We need to come up with a new curriculum that all churches will use. So, of course, as General Convention often does, they put together a task force, and several task forces took place in the 60s and the 70s. And then with the 79 Book of Common Prayer in the 90s, another task force came to be. Holy Eucharist was the primary service of a Sunday, as we know today. Sunday school began to be called church school. I'm not sure why that shift happened, but also then it became, in more recent years, probably the past 20 years, the word Christian formation became, realizing that it's very holistic, it's lifelong, it's life-wide, it's life deep, it's in everything that we do. And lots of grassroots curriculum came up. Like I mentioned, Living the Good News, a lectionary-based curriculum, the Episcopal Children's Curriculum, the Episcopal Curriculum for Youth, Godly Play, Journey to Adulthood. All of those things really came up from the grassroots because there was a lack of something else. And people were looking for a variety of ways, as they were really trying to understand how best do people learn, and how best does the church, how can the church continue to pass along faith? And with the Book of Common Prayer that we have today, the new prayer book, really went back to the early church. That first part, when I mentioned the Didache, the Kerygma, the Koinonia, the all of those pieces that Maria Harris talks about, and the writings of folks like John Westerhoff, in which he wrote that faith is caught, not taught. We need to stop teaching faith. We need to live it by example so that others can catch it. So what went wrong during this period of time is that the church took on the role of forming its children and youth, and in some respects, its adults, if the adults even came to that. The Episcopal Church, in a task force in the 90s, came up with a document instead of a specific curriculum, and that's called Called to Teach and Learn. It was written by a number of folks. Those of you who know Frederica Harris Thompson was one of the authors. Jas Westerhoff was also, but there were a number of others that were part of it also. And in the document that Jennifer mentioned that you'll have in your toolbox, there's a link that you can download that now. It's no longer in print, but it's something that the Episcopal Church Center did publish. They did publish a number of materials through the 1980s, and they were more overarching kinds of things for churches to use that were all passed by General Convention. This text I call people to all of the time because it really talks about, although the photos in it are extremely old, they're black and white, and they you can tell by hairstyles and clothing that it is dated, but the pedagogy in it is still very wise and very appropriate for us to use today in that. Let me move on here. So I've given you a ton of information. Is it, Rowan, I'm going to ask you, is there anything in the chat that we should be going over before we go into breakout rooms?
No, not right now.
Okay.
Mostly people letting us know that they're looking forward to the recording.
Oh, okay. Well, hopefully it will come out good for them. So what we'd like to do now is really think about what your experience was like as a child or a teen. Maybe you weren't even part of a church at the time, but looking at think about the children. We haven't talked about that future generation. We're going to, when we come back briefly, my granddaughter's generation, which are Generation Z and Alpha generation, who are in our churches today. But certainly we bring our own experience to the church when we come into it. So whether you're a millennial, a Gen X, or a baby boomer, we bring our own experience to the table when we are passing on faith, when we're organizing how we're going to teach or choosing what we're going to teach and what the model is, and the way we do it. So as you go into your breakout rooms, and we'll have we can probably do about 10 minutes for that, I think. Talk about what was your experience as a child or teen, whether it was in church or just in talking about God or faith. How was it passed along, and what was your family experience? What can we learn from the past that I've sort of explained, and the shifts back and forth from my grandmother's generation to my parents, to mine, to my children's? And then what do we need to let go? What no longer works, whether it worked in the past or not, do we need to let go? So those are 3 pieces to talk about in your breakout rooms, and then we will come back and we'll share from this.
So Sharon,
so I think there's a small enough group here. Is there anything anybody'd like to share that you found enlightening from your small group conversation?
Just how varied our growing up was. I had none as a child, was Baptist. The others had different roads and how they got to where they are now. But just how varied we are, and we're all in the same place now.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Anyone else? We were talking, and Rowan, can I ask you to share what you shared about the parents at your church and stuff? Because I think that's really fascinating as to where we are today, and what has been taught from past generations.
Sure. I'll share briefly my own background. I'm a minister for Christian formation now, and I grew up in the Roman Catholic Church. And the 2 memories I have of my formation growing up were the guardian angel coloring page of the guardian angel like swooping the child out from in front of a car while the kid was chasing a ball. That's 1. And 2 was, we had one youth group meeting. My friend and I wanted to start a youth group, and the priest came, and we decided we wanted to read the Bible. So we started at the beginning. And our first question for the priest was, how come the creation story is in here twice? You never told us the creation story was in here twice. And the priest didn't want to answer the question, and that was our last youth group meeting. So that is my experience as a kid that brought me to where I am as someone who forms children now and works with parents. And the parents that I work with are very educated. They feel like they're experts in their fields. They want to be good at what they do, and they feel like they're not experts in faith, especially their own faith, because they didn't have formation, or they had formation that covered, the same 2 things every year. They know one story of the Bible really well. And because they don't feel like experts, they're afraid to teach their own children and to take ownership of their faith and believe that they can teach it. And the only thing I've found so far that combats that is convincing some of the parents to become godly play teachers. And the hurdle to convince them to do this is very, very high, but once they realize that all they're doing is wondering along with the kids, they finally start to feel like the tiniest bit of ownership about their own faith and their own faith formation and journey. And I wish I could get all of my parents to just sit and do that together, but maybe one day.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And there's that whole thing about, we have a culture today in which there are experts. And so, we value in some respects higher education. And so people want to become an expert in their field. And that's how they, so when it comes to church, they don't feel they're expert at all. So here they're the church people, they're experts, so they can teach my children, and they don't have any background or knowledge to be able to do that. So we're, I think, and we'll talk about next week, is, forming faith at home, and how do we help support parents in doing that when, we have a real I think the church really failed the current Gen X and millennials in many ways, Gen Y, in that we tried to make everybody happy, and, do what everybody else wants to do without, giving them engagement on that and application and things like that. I think there was lots of infighting going on in the church also, that I know for my kids, that was like, they saw the underside, the belly of the beast. And so they're like, why, you guys aren't acting like Christians, for that. But any other thoughts about
well, I wanted to share, piggybacking on Rowan's comment, is that if you already don't know, I'm a big believer in godly play as well as catechesis, the Good Shepherd. And my mother was a catechist, and she said she learned the Bible from the catechesis, the Good Shepherd, because you're required to make all your materials. But if you already don't know, and I just went and got mine, there are at home godly play story boxes, and here's my set for creation. And these are something that if your church has, and then have a lending library to send home, or I've also seen churches make miniature, for example, sets, and with some guides for your families as far as learning how to tell the story. And that really is equipping them with the story and the language of wonder. And then also for you EDOW people, and anybody who has access to the EDOW website, under Lent, there's all the godly play videos for the Faces of Easter. So just go to EDOW Lent, and you'll see a link to Faces of Easter. And so they can watch the videos with their kids. So we just have to, the reality of the parents not necessarily knowing, and then also not wanting to they're so used to looking like experts in front of their children. They don't want to not look like the experts with them, right? So.
And Jennifer, they also have parent pages that go through the stories that help parents figure them out.
And I was just saying, this is crazy because I have no grandchildren. I have no small children, but I have godly play at home in my house.
Godly Play is a YouTube channel. So you can go and look at all of those stories there. So if you don't have godly play teachers to do, there's lots more workarounds for things now today too.
And it's really for all ages. Like Jennifer, no shame. You can have godly play for yourself. My congregation is getting a godly play story on Bishop Barbara Harris as their homily on Sunday from me. So
cool.
Everybody.
Mm-hmm. 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 What are some things that we can learn from the past? What are some things that we did do well in the past as a whatever generation for helping pass on faith? Did any of you have any thoughts about that?
I loved the connection to the summer camps, because I would definitely say that was huge. I also think the youth mission trip movement Certainly my kids who are now all grown all went to New Orleans after Katrina, have stories to tell about, those experiences. Sort of that hands-on experiential, what does it mean to share God's love and how do you see Christ in others? Those were huge. Yeah.
Experiential stuff, I think, is definitely something for in the future. I'm sorry, interrupted.
Yeah,
someone.
I do agree with Meredith. I too made sure that my kids did all those things, like all the camp. In my diocese of Long Island, we have a camp at Wading River, and in our youth ministries, we would try to take our kids away to EYE, to whatever that's going on. I remember my son, he was the youth rep for Province 2 at the convention where Bishop Jean was, certified as a reverend. I know it was a lot of other kids, it was like a little traumatic experience for them because we all know where our church were going. And my son, I'm still proud of him to this day, is that he was able to bring them together, because he would say, in my house, my mom and my dad, they just have no problem with Bishop Jean. And they taught us everybody is God's kids and everybody made their own choice and we respect it. And so, bringing up kids was good. Now my grandkids is a different story. I can't get them come to church. And you wouldn't believe their parents were the ones, was in the choir, was an acolyte, started the youth group, but their children now, I don't know. And one of the best experiences as a youth leader in our church, we went, I think it was in 2000, we went to Wyoming to EYE, and my church, along with the Diocese of New York, we were really interested in the Matthew Shepherd story. We took them to the space where he was killed. We took them to the bar where he was. And so, it was very traumatic for some who, was not accustomed or didn't even know what they were getting into. But in the end, it worked out good, where we were able to show, look, this is love. This is what God's love is about. And I know up to this day, those kids are grown up and they still, thank God, they still look just as young with some of them. And so we're able to, keep together. Some of them are still in our diocese, still go to church. A lot of them that went away to college never came back. Some still go to church, but periodically. And I always say that in that period between college and coming back to church, they come back when they get their first baby baptized, and then they rekindle links, and then they come visiting. So we have gone through a lot. I'm talking about my own diocese, Long Island, in trying to keep our young people and trying to welcome all genders, wherever you are welcome. So that's, we've been able to do stuff like that.
Well, certainly experiences such as you were able to experience, Linda, with your youth and with your kids, those are formational a whole lot more, I believe, than sitting in a classroom, or even sometimes sitting in worship, because you're living out your faith. And that's what I believe sticks with us, no matter what our age is, from the littlest child to our elders, for that. And so how can we, as a faith community, do more of those kinds of things, being out in the world? I think the pandemic has shown us certainly that church is not a building. We can still, even though for some, I miss not being physically present in church, but I still feel like I'm going to church. But that it's really that sense of community, that koinonia, at first. And when we leave that behind and we focus on so much of the other stuff, we miss out. So that's always been a learning for me, is koinonia comes first, before anything.
I have a question for you, Sharon.
Yeah.
And so what struck me when you were telling your story, and I know we have that other question of like, what do we need to let go of? But what struck me in your story is that so much of what the church is able to do, or what we end up doing, I don't know which is the right way to look at it, is so much influenced by what's happening in society, right?
Mhm.
And so my question would be, how, given that's true, how does, and I know that Christianity in some respects is countercultural. How are we faithful to our children, knowing that what ways can we look at what's happening in culture and say, how can we join that to get the gospel out, right? I mean, what is it that's happening? Culture is so huge. Like the kids are, most of the time, they're not in church. So how do we look at the culture in a way that we can partner with it? It seems to me that that's the way to go when we're thinking about faith formation for children these days.
And what's going on in the world that impacts how we teach and all of that. So I think for sure, environmentalism and climate crisis right now. I mean, and that's what most young people that's what they're fearful of, because that's what they're inheriting now for sure. And the church certainly should have a voice and a place in that. So that's a cultural piece that we're having to come to grips with as a country and as a world. And why can't our congregations also get more involved? I mean, some are, a lot, but others, don't talk about that very much or aren't involved. Whether it's even simple as recycling, but how are we helping our communities do that? How are we out in our community helping the whole either Me Too movement or Black Lives Matter? How are we getting involved in those things? Because that's what our young people are growing up with right now, and they're seeing that. So how are we spending time focusing on those things? Well, lots of churches are trying to avoid it. Yeah. I think that's what, certainly, I have my 5-year-old granddaughter is almost 6. She's totally engaged in environment stuff. I mean, she knows more stuff than I do about that. She can spin off about, how you take care of this or that and the environment and what's harmful and what's not. And also about, women's issues and that empowerment. Folks like Amanda Gorham, I think of, as that speak to a lot of those things, and Greta Thunberg.
So maybe if we're doing a series for children or a VBS for kids, you could do a series on holy troublemakers, for instance, right? And then bring in scripture as opposed to doing a VBS on Paul's travels to Corinth.
Yes,
exactly.
Well, we can still talk about Paul, but talk about him in,
I'm also the confirmation coordinator for my church, and not the 2019 before COVID hit. I'm teaching the confirmation class, and I'm talking about being kind, and I'm trying to teach them about how God created the world, not the creation story, but he created it with love and how he loves us. And in the middle of my teaching, this little boy says, "Oh, that reminds me," and he called I've never heard in my life. But the whole class erupt in a whole set of knowledge about this character. Well, my class went through the window. I listen carefully, and you're right about the kids. And they give me the story about this either hip hop person or something who was homeless. But when he made his money, he remembered the homeless people under the bridge that he used to sleep on as a teenager. I'm like, well, I've never heard of this. Yeah, I've heard about, Beyonce, Rihanna, see, And the kids are like, they're old people. And they bring new stuff to me.
Mhm.
So I give them a exercise. I say, I want each of you to say that everybody knows something about this guy. Let me tell you, I can't remember his name to this day. And the very next week, everybody came with some story that matched him to the love of God. Well, I knew then that the old way how we all went to confirmation class was not coming back.
Mhm.
I knew then, even although I followed the tenets of the catechism, I still had to bring that into a way where they could see people in their own lives
Mhm.
who are living out the love of God.
Mhm.
The first time I joined with, I go to my church parish is St. Gabriel's, Brooklyn, and I joined with Trinity Wall Street, right? And I went on their website to see what they were doing for their kids, and they were doing like field trips and feeding the poor and giving sandwiches. I was like, yeah, you know what? This Sunday we will talk about sharing. The next Sunday we're going on a field trip, and
Mhm.
so I was saying from 11 to 13 to do the sandwich and feed the poor, and from the 14 to 17, I take them down to Chinatown to help paint a space.
Mhm.
So because by then I know that I could not go back to just having those children sit there. Why as I say, Elijah went this, and what is God and what is the church? They're acolytes. They grew up in the church. What am I doing?
Mhm.
Well,
Faith, I mean,
to
faith,
rearrange the whole thing.
yeah, faith in action. The confirmation class at my parish, we do the traditional stuff and we're talking about stuff, but the things that when they do faith statements and talk about what impacted them the most over our year, they always bring up going to New Haven and serving at Trinity on the Green and doing their, worship on the Green with them. They always talk about that, and because they all share blessings with each other. They talk about going to Temple Bethel locally and sitting with a rabbi and opening up the scrolls. I mean, those experiential, hands-on, faith in action kinds of things. And I think, in the future, doing those intergenerationally, be one. In our few minutes left, I'm going to share my screen again. I only have a couple things I want to share, and then we'll talk about next week. Share. Oops, let's move this. So this is my granddaughter in church. It was Easter with my son-in-law. And it's interesting. My son-in-law is raised in the Catholic Church, but he says he wants to be an Episcopalian. So he says, what do I need to do that? So we talked about that. But so Gen Z and Gen Alpha, which are in our churches now, and I think Bishop Curry's initiative with the Jesus movement are those things for us to focus on in the future: racial reconciliation, evangelism, and care of creation. So the evangelism part is not like what evangelism was when I was a kid. It's just sharing our stories and acting like Christians. That part of being in conversation with other people about that. But so next week we will talk about those things a lot more, what we do with faith in the future, how we what we've learned from the pandemic, and what are the characteristics of these two generations and how we can adapt for them, and how can we be out in the community a whole lot more to look at those to put our faith into action. So that's what we'll be doing next week. Do you have, before we conclude, I wanted just to check in and see what some topics you hope we do cover next week when we are talking about the future, and what some of those predictions are, and not just how I see what kinds of things that we can take from the past and bring to the future. But what the needs are right now. I have a number in mind that I know people have asked me about, but what are yours? What kinds of things would you like to make sure we cover next week in talking about what do we do with all this information moving to the future?
I personally would love to hear any sort of best practices that you all have. Because I think that's sometimes the best way to figure out what you're going to do in your own local church is just to hear stories of what's working in other places and seeing what you can adopt and adapt for your own situation.
Great. We'll, for sure, we will do that. Anybody else?
So on the other side of that, perhaps something that was tried but didn't work, and why, or why you think it maybe didn't work.
I'm writing this down. I mean, there are certainly things that would have worked in some period of time, but they don't today. And I believe that lots of times those, we teach how we learn ourselves. And if we were taught a certain way, that's our default in teaching. And we need to keep that in mind all of the time. Well, and I've certainly learned that, watching my 5-year-old or my 6-year-old granddaughter while she's been on Zoom with her teacher, and how they're learning to read is totally different than how certainly I learned or my children learned how to read. And I taught reading for a while too. And how she was doing
last year too.
So different.
Fast.
Yeah, she's tapping out words. So it's like, what the heck are you doing? And not to spell it right is okay. At least at this point, when you're 6. Anything?
I'd love to hear what you know about digital discipleship for children and families.
Great. And if anybody else wants to add to that conversation, I
will say that the Diocese of Washington is in conversation with an app developer for our Path of Discipleship, so it can be on our Android phones and our iPhones. So hopefully within a year, we'll have that rolled out for everybody. But, not only how do you get something out, but how do you get it through to people? What are people engaging with?
Right, because we can come up with all kinds of great ideas, but how do we get people to use it and do it? I think about those take-home kits that we've been sending to families, at least in my parish. We've sent them Lent in a bag. We've sent them stuff for we're going to send them stuff for Holy Week. I mean, are people really using them, and how so? And do we need to continue doing that kind of thing?
And also, how are we reaching out to people who are either without children or single?
Yep. That whole use of the term family.
Also, how to address adults who say they are spiritual. They deal with spirituality, but are not necessarily into religion.
Right. We will definitely talk about that next week. The nuns, or the spiritual but not religious, and those who come Sunday, Easter and Christmas. Yeah, because that's definitely what I believe the church is, competing with, or if that's even the right way to put it. Yeah. Great, thank you. I've got my presentation, but I will tweak it so that it definitely fits what you're looking for next week. And I'll make sure that we have time to talk about all of those things.